The room was not abandoned. That was the most painful part. There was a bed. There was a crucifix on the wall. There was a small wooden table beside the window. There was even a dinner tray still covered in plastic, waiting like someone had promised to return and then forgot. But the room was cold. Not dramatically cold. Not the kind of cold that makes people panic. It was the quieter kind. The kind that enters the hands first, then the bones, then the soul. On that narrow bed lay an old priest who had once crossed oceans for the church. He had preached in villages where the roads disappeared after rain. He had baptized children whose names he would never hear again. He had buried the dead, comforted mothers, walked through fever, poverty, and war. For most of his life, when people called, he came. And now, at 91 years old, he was waiting for someone to notice that his room had no warmth. When Pope Leo XIV stepped into that room, there were no cameras, no choir, no formal greeting, no carefully arranged ceremony. Only a young nurse standing frozen near the doorway, a tired secretary trying not to speak too soon, and an old man slowly opening his eyes. The priest looked at the white figure beside his bed. He did not recognize the Pope. He did not see power. He did not see Rome. He did not see the weight of an office that millions of people looked toward for guidance. He only saw a man standing close enough to help. Then he asked one simple question. "Are you the doctor?" For a moment no one answered, because in that question the whole failure was revealed. The old priest did not recognize authority. He recognized only the possibility that someone had finally come. And sometimes that is how the truth enters a room. Not through an accusation, not through a scandal, not through a headline, but through one forgotten person asking whether help has arrived. The visit had begun before sunrise. Rome was still half asleep. The streets near the Vatican were pale with early morning light. Delivery trucks moved slowly through the quiet. The stones carried the last cold of winter. There was no announcement on the official schedule, no press release, no photographers waiting near the gate. Only a car leaving the Vatican, while most of the city still believed it was an ordinary morning. Pope Leo XIV sat in the back seat, holding his breviary in both hands. He was not reading. Beside him sat Father Andres Valdivia, his personal secretary, who had learned that the Pope's silence was rarely empty. Some men are silent because they have nothing to say. Others are silent because they have already begun to decide what must be done. This was the second kind. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had reached the papal residence. It was not an official report. It did not come through a polished channel. It was not written in the language of committees, procedures, or administrative concern. It was handwritten by an elderly nun whose fingers had begun to tremble. Her name was Sister Josefina. She had served the church for more than 60 years. She had taught children, cared for the sick, prayed beside the dying, and spent most of her life doing work that was never meant to make her famous. For the last years of her life, she had lived in a care home for retired clergy and religious workers, a place that looked correct on paper. The reports were clean, the budget was approved, the building was maintained, the chapel was beautiful. The institution existed, and because it existed, many assumed the people inside it were being cared for. But Sister Josefina knew the difference between a building that remains open and a home that remains human. So she wrote. She wrote about corridors that were too cold. She wrote about meals that arrived early and sat untouched for hours. She wrote about nurses who were not cruel, only exhausted. She wrote about staff members stretched so thin that compassion itself had become difficult to practice. She did not accuse anyone of hatred. That was what made the letter harder to ignore. Hatred would have been easier to condemn. This was something quieter, a system where everyone could say they had done their part, while the people at the center of it were still waiting in the cold. Near the end of the letter, Sister Josefina wrote the sentence that stopped the Pope. They were not asking for luxury. They were asking not to be forgotten. Pope Leo read that line once. Then again. Then a third time. And beside it he made a small mark with a pencil. Not because he had finished reading, because he had finished deciding. The care home stood on a narrow road outside the familiar heart of Vatican life. In summer, perhaps the garden might have looked peaceful, but on that morning the trees were bare, the iron balconies looked tired, and the building seemed to carry the strange dignity of places that have been neglected without ever becoming visibly ruined. The gate was unlocked, but no one was there to receive them. That was the first sign. Not a scandale, not chaos, just absence. Father Andres pressed the intercom. They waited. Nearly 2 minutes passed before the gate finally buzzed open. Still, no one came outside. The Pope entered without ceremony. The entrance hall was clean. That was the second painful thing. Neglect does not always look dirty. Sometimes it is polished. Sometimes the floors are scrubbed, the statue is dusted, the paperwork is complete, and still the human soul of a place has gone missing. Near the door, a statue of Our Lady stood beside a votive candle that had burned down to nothing. No one had replaced it. A young nurse appeared from a side corridor and stopped as soon as she saw him. Her face went pale. She was not prepared. No one had warned her. No one had given her time to arrange the room, hide the mistakes, or turn a difficult morning into a respectable visit. She said almost in a whisper, "Holy Father, we were not told." Pope Leo looked at her gently. "I know," he said. "I would like to walk." The nurse's name was Elena. She was young, but she already carried the tiredness of someone who had been forced to become older too quickly. As they moved through the corridor, she explained that only a few nurses were covering dozens of residents. She did not say it as an excuse. She said it like a confession, and the Pope listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask who was responsible. He did not reach for anger too quickly. There is a kind of anger that wants to punish before it understands. This was not that. He walked slowly, stopping at open doors. In one room, an elderly priest sat near the window, fully dressed, staring out at a garden he could no longer walk through. In another room, a woman in her 90s lay with a rosary beside her pillow, her lips moving in prayer so softly that it seemed less like speech and more like breathing. In a third room, a priest appeared to be asleep, though morning had already come. Beside him sat a dinner tray from the night before, still covered, still waiting. The Pope stopped. There are objects that accuse more powerfully than words. A broken heater, an empty chair, a call bell no one answers, a meal left beside a bed until it becomes proof that someone has slipped beyond attention. Elena looked at the tray and lowered her eyes. She explained that the night shift had been short. 2 people were sick. There were too many rooms, too many needs, too many small emergencies becoming normal. The Pope did not look away from the bed. He asked only one question. "What is his name?" Elena answered quietly. "Father Lorenzo." He was 91 years old. He had spent decades as a missionary far from Rome. He had given his youth to people who could not repay him. He had lived the kind of life that institutions praise in speeches and forget in budgets. The Pope stepped into the room. No one announced him. No one corrected the old priest's posture. No one adjusted the blanket for the sake of appearances. The old man opened his eyes slowly. For a moment he simply looked at the visitor. There was no sudden recognition, no dramatic realization, no awareness that the Bishop of Rome was standing beside his bed. Then something changed in his face. Not recognition of office, recognition of presence. Someone had stopped. Someone was looking at him directly. Someone had entered the room without rushing to leave it. Pope Leo placed his hand lightly on the priest's arm and greeted him softly. Father Lorenzo answered in a thin voice. Then he asked if the Pope was the doctor. The question stayed in the air. It was innocent. That was why it hurt. The Pope could have corrected him. He could have said, "No, Father, I am the Pope." He could have restored the order of titles, authority, and recognition. But he did not. He only said that he was visiting. And Father Lorenzo seemed satisfied with that. A visitor was enough. After a lifetime of serving others, he was no longer asking for importance, only company. Pope Leo remained beside him for several minutes. He made sure the water was within reach. He touched the blanket. He looked at the tray. He looked at the cold walls. Nothing in the room changed immediately. The heater was still broken. The food was still untouched. The old priest was still frail. But something had changed in the person who had seen it. When the Pope stepped back into the corridor, Father Andres noticed his face. It was controlled, almost too controlled. His jaw had tightened. His eyes were steady. It was not the expression of a man surprised by suffering. It was the expression of a man who understood that suffering had been made ordinary. And that was worse. They found Sister Josephina on the second floor. She was sitting in a common room with two other elderly nuns. A prayer book lay open before her. Her hands were folded carefully, as if even in old age she did not want to occupy too much space. When she looked up and saw the Pope in the doorway, she did not react at first. She stared at him for several seconds. Then she placed one hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Pope Leo walked toward her. But he did not stand above her. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat across from her. That small gesture mattered. Power usually remains standing. Mercy sits down. "I received your letter," he said. Sister Josephina opened her eyes. They were filled with tears, but she held them back with the discipline of someone who had spent a lifetime not making herself the center of anything. "I was not sure it would arrive," she said. "It arrived," the Pope answered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There are conversations where words come slowly, because the truth has already arrived before them. Sister Josephina told him that the residents were not ungrateful. She wanted him to understand that. They loved the church. They had given their lives to it. They had no desire to shame anyone. They were not demanding comfort as a reward. Then her voice changed. "But they are very cold," she said, "and very alone." The last word settled into the room. Alone. Not poor, not angry, not rebellious. Alone. That is one of the most frightening words in old age, because loneliness does not always mean no one exists nearby. Sometimes loneliness means people pass your door every day, but no one truly enters your life anymore. Sister Josephina showed him the chapel first. It was small and beautiful. The altar was clean. The flowers were fresh. The candles were arranged properly. Everything in that room had been protected from decline. The Pope looked at it in silence. A beautiful chapel is not a problem, but a beautiful chapel beside a freezing corridor asks a terrible question. What do we protect first? The symbol of mercy, or the person who needs it? Then they went to the kitchen. The cook, a man who had worked there for years, looked ashamed before anyone blamed him. He explained that he was preparing meals for many residents with a budget that had not kept up with reality. He spoke carefully, like someone who still respected the institution, but no longer knew how to defend what it had allowed. The heating system in one wing had been reported months earlier. It was still not repaired. The Pope turned to Father Andres. "Write that down," he said. For 3 hours, Pope Leo walked through the building. He did not give a speech. He did not pose for photographs. He did not allow the visit to become a performance. He sat beside residents. He listened to old stories. He held hands that had once held chalices, children, shovels, hospital sheets, and the hands of the dying. They spoke of distant countries, of parishes built with almost nothing, of small chapels where the roof leaked, of villages where Mass was celebrated under trees, of hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, of years when faith was not a decoration but the only thing people had left. These were not abstract servants of the church. They were the memory of the church. They were the ones who had carried it into places where there was no marble, no choir, no ceremony, only dust, heat, hunger, sickness, hope. And now some of them were living in rooms where dinner arrived cold and help arrived late. No one needed to be cruel for this to happen. That was the terrible lesson. Sometimes cruelty is not born from hatred. Sometimes it is born from distance. One office away, one report away, one budget line away, one unanswered letter away. Slowly the human face disappears. A resident becomes a number. A room becomes a maintenance request. A meal becomes a cost. A nurse becomes a staffing issue. A lifetime of service becomes a sentence in an annual report. And everyone can say the system is functioning, even while the people inside it are fading. By noon, the Pope had returned to the Vatican. The first phone call was calm. That made it more serious. He did not raise his voice. He did not speak in dramatic language. He simply described what he had seen. A broken heater, too few nurses, meals left untouched, an elderly missionary sleeping beside a dinner tray no one had collected. Then he gave instructions. not suggestions. Instruction. The heating would be repaired immediately. Additional staff would be assigned. The food budget would be reviewed. A full audit would begin, and the review would not remain trapped in comfortable offices. Someone would have to walk the corridors. Someone would have to sit with the residents. Someone would have to ask the nurses what they were carrying. Someone would have to look directly at what the reports had hidden. When an official began to explain the usual procedure, the Pope interrupted gently but firmly. "I am not asking how this is usually processed," he said. "I am telling you what must happen. There are moments when leadership is not about speaking loudly. It is about refusing to let procedure become an excuse for delay." The next day, Pope Leo recorded a statement. There was no grand stage, no flags, no careful arrangement meant to make authority look larger. He sat in a plain chair. A camera was placed in front of him. Father Andres stood nearby. The Pope spoke about the elderly, not as a category, not as a burden, not as a problem to be managed by offices and budgets. He spoke of them as living memory. He said a church that honors saints from centuries past must not ignore the servants of God still sitting in its own corridors. He said it was possible to preserve buildings and still lose people. It was possible to balance accounts and still fail in love. It was possible to maintain a chapel and forget the person freezing in the room beside it. Then he paused. The pause was long enough to make the room feel smaller. He spoke of an old priest who had given his life to the poor. A priest who had crossed oceans. A priest who had baptized children, comforted families, and served people who had no way to repay him. And then he said that this priest at the end of his life had looked at him and asked whether he was the doctor. The Pope stopped again. His eyes lowered. When he looked back at the camera, his voice was different, not weaker, more human. He said that the question had broken something open in him, because the old priest was not asking for honor. He was asking, without knowing it, whether care had finally entered the room. And the church, he said, must never allow its elderly servants to wonder whether care is coming. Then he said something that many people would repeat later. Love does not file a report and call it mercy. Love shows up. Love asks whether someone is warm. Love notices the untouched meal. Love sits down before it speaks. Love repairs the heater without waiting for the next committee. Love remembers the person after the applause has ended. He asked every diocese, every congregation, every institution caring for elderly people to look again, not only at documents, at rooms, at hands, at faces, at the nurses who are trying not to collapse, at the residents who no longer complain because they have learned that complaining does not always bring change. He asked them to walk the corridors slowly, to enter the rooms, to ask when the last warm meal was served, to ask when the heating was last repaired, to ask who has not had a visitor, to ask who is afraid to die alone. And if the answers were uncomfortable, he said, then remain uncomfortable long enough to change them. By evening, the statement had begun to spread. Some people spoke about the Pope's tears, but the tears were not the real story. The real story was not that a powerful man cried. The real story was that a forgotten man had been seen. That is much rarer. Tears can move people for a moment. Seeing someone can change what happens next. At the care home, things began to move quickly. A maintenance crew arrived. The East Wing grew warmer. More nurses were assigned. The kitchen budget was reviewed. None of it fixed everything. Real neglect is not undone in a single afternoon. But for the first time in a long time, the building was no longer just a clean document on someone's desk. It was a house full of people. People with names. People with histories. People who had once been strong. People who had carried others and now needed to be carried gently in return. That evening, Elena brought a warm meal to Father Lorenzo. Steam rose from the plate. A small thing. Almost nothing if you are not the one who has been waiting. But for a forgotten person, small things are never small. A warm meal says you still matter. A repaired heater says your comfort is not a luxury. A visitor sitting beside the bed says your life did not disappear when your strength did. Father Lorenzo did not fully understand what had happened. When someone told him that the Pope had spoken about him, he listened carefully. Then he smiled faintly. He said he had thought the visitor was the doctor. Then after a moment he added that the man had been kind. And a kind man, doctor or not, was good company. After that he picked up his rosary. The room was warm. Dinner had arrived hot. Outside the corridor was still quiet. But it was no longer the same silence. Before it had been the silence of neglect. Now it was the silence after someone had finally noticed. And perhaps that is where real change begins. Not always with a miracle. Not always with thunder. Not always with a document signed in a room of important people. Sometimes change begins when one person walks into a forgotten place and refuses to look away. Because the measure of any church, any nation, any family, or any human heart is not how beautifully it honors its heroes when they are strong. It is how gently it carries them when they can no longer stand. The old priest had once crossed oceans to serve people who needed him. At the end of his life, he did not ask for applause. He did not ask for a statue. He did not ask for history to remember his name. He asked if help had come. And on that morning, help finally entered the room. If this story made you think of someone who has been forgotten, do not only remember them in your heart. Call them, visit them, sit beside them, ask whether they are warm. Because sometimes the most sacred thing a human being can do is simply show up.